I rushed into the Monday meeting completely exhausted, but prepared. I'd stayed up late finishing the quarterly analysis Dean had requested, making sure every number was perfect. The conference room was already full when I slid into my seat, apologizing quietly for being the last to arrive. Dean Carver, my manager, looked up from his laptop with that smile I'd learned to dread. He made a show of looking me up and down, then delivered his assessment loud enough for everyone to hear. Something about my outfit being quite the choice for a professional environment. Asked if I was trying to distract the team from actual work. The room filled with nervous laughter while I sat there feeling my face burn with humiliation. It wasn't the first inappropriate comment Dean had made, but it was the first time he'd done it so publicly. Usually his remarks came during one-on-one meetings or in passing in the hallway. But this felt different. This felt like he was testing how far he could push, establishing dominance in front of witnesses who would laugh along rather than defend me. I tried to focus on the meeting agenda, but my hands were shaking. Around me, co-workers were still chuckling, already moving on like nothing significant had happened. Like my manager hadn't just sexually harassed me in front of the entire team on a Monday morning. The messages started that night. Dean sent a text at 10:47 p.m. about a project deadline, which seemed normal enough, but his follow-up wasn't about work. He wanted to know if I was still awake if I lived alone, what I did to relax after stressful days. The tone shifted from professional to personal so smoothly, I almost convinced myself I was reading too much into it. I kept my responses brief and work-focused, answered the project question, ignored the personal ones. But Dean was persistent. More messages came over the following days, always late at night, always starting with some work-related pretext before veering into territory that made me uncomfortable. He'd comment on my appearance from that day, ask about my weekend plans, suggest we grab drinks to discuss my career development. The word choice was always just careful enough to maintain plausible deniability. Nothing explicitly inappropriate, but the intention underneath was unmistakable. I tried different strategies, short responses, delayed responses, redirecting everything back to work topics, but Dean interpreted my professionalism as playing hard to get. The messages continued, growing bolder as my discomfort became more obvious. He was enjoying the chase, enjoying my discomfort, enjoying his power over an employee who couldn't simply tell him to stop without risking her job. I approached HR on a Thursday afternoon, my stomach in knots. Asked to speak with someone about a workplace concern. The HR representative, a woman named Trish who I'd thought might understand, listened to my carefully worded explanation about Dean's inappropriate communications and comments about my appearance. She chuckled, actually chuckled, told me Dean was known for being friendly with everyone, that he was just trying to make the workplace feel less formal. Some people appreciated a manager who didn't take everything so seriously. Maybe I was being a bit oversensitive. I tried to explain it felt different, that the late-night personal messages made me uncomfortable. Trish's smile became more fixed. She suggested I might be misinterpreting normal workplace friendliness. Dean had never had complaints before. Was I sure I wasn't reading too much into harmless behavior? I left her office feeling worse than when I'd entered. Not only was nothing going to change, but now I was on record as the oversensitive employee who couldn't handle a friendly manager. I'd reported harassment and been dismissed as dramatic. And Trish's comment about Dean never having complaints before made me wonder how many other women had tried to speak up only to be shut down exactly like this. Dean's behavior escalated after my failed HR attempt. During presentations, he'd stand too close, his hand on my shoulder or the small of my back. He'd lean in to whisper comments about the content, his breath on my ear, his body pressed against mine in ways that couldn't be accidental. He started taking credit for my work more systematically. My analysis would appear in his reports with no attribution. My ideas in meetings would be reframed as his insights. When I'd try to speak up, he'd talk over me, then summarize my points as if they'd been his all along. The late-night messages continued despite my increasingly curt responses. He'd comment on what I'd worn that day, rate my outfits, suggest what would look better on me. Tell me I seemed tense, that I should learn to relax more. Maybe if I joined him for those drinks, he could help me distress. The worst part was how calculated it all was. Dean was careful never to leave evidence in emails. The touching happened in public, but briefly enough that I couldn't prove it was deliberate. The comments were always framed as jokes or professional feedback. He was systematically harassing me while maintaining perfect plausible deniability. My coworkers started avoiding me. At first I thought I was imagining it, but the pattern became undeniable. Conversations would stop when I approached the break room. People who used to eat lunch with me suddenly had other plans. In meetings, my suggestions were met with silence or quick subject changes. I discovered why during an overheard hallway conversation. Dean had been spreading rumors that I was obsessed with him, told people I'd been making inappropriate advances that he'd had to professionally decline, framed my discomfort as rejection-fueled vindictiveness. My reputation was being destroyed by the same man who was harassing me, and people believed him because he was the manager, and I was just the uncomfortable employee who'd complained to HR. The isolation was its own form of punishment. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman who was supposedly causing drama with the boss. My professional relationships evaporated. Projects I'd been collaborating on were reassigned without explanation. I'd become a liability people avoided rather than a colleague they respected. Even worse, the isolation made me more vulnerable to Dean. With no work friends to witness or validate what was happening, everything became he said, she said. And in those dynamics, management always won. HR called me in for another meeting. I thought maybe they'd reconsidered, that someone had finally taken my complaint seriously. Instead, Trish sat me down with a grave expression and warned me about the serious consequences of false accusations. Dean had apparently filed a complaint about my behavior toward him, claimed I'd been making him uncomfortable with inappropriate attention. HR had conducted an investigation, meaning they'd asked Dean if my harassment allegations were true, and he'd said no while adding his own counter-allegations. Trish explained that the company took harassment very seriously, that accusing a manager of misconduct without evidence was a serious matter, that if I continued making these claims, there could be professional consequences for creating a hostile work environment. I sat there in stunned silence while my harasser's enabler warned me about making false accusations. The system designed to protect employees from abuse was being weaponized against me. Dean had turned everything around, and HR was helping him do it. I was now officially the problem employee, and he was the professional manager dealing with an obsessed subordinate. Walking out of that meeting, I understood with perfect clarity that the company wasn't going to help me. They were going to protect Dean and punish me for speaking up. The client pitch was my breaking point. I'd prepared the presentation for weeks, developed a comprehensive strategy for landing a major account, but during the pitch itself, Dean interrupted me constantly, talked over my points, made comments about my nervousness, my delivery, my stutter that only appeared when I was under extreme stress. At one point, he actually mimicked my stutter while explaining a concept I'd developed. The client representatives laughed, my own co-workers smiled uncomfortably, and I stood there fighting tears while my manager mocked a speech pattern that emerged from anxiety he'd created. After the pitch, Dean pulled me aside, told me I needed to work on my presentation skills. Maybe public speaking wasn't my strength. Perhaps I should focus on background research and let him handle client-facing work. All said with concerned professionalism, reframing his bullying as constructive feedback. I went to the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was systematic destruction of my professional capabilities and confidence. Dean was making it impossible for me to do my job effectively, while blaming me for the difficulties he'd created. That night I made a decision. If the system wouldn't protect me, I'd protect myself. I started documenting everything with obsessive attention to detail. My office badge doubled as a small camera, something I'd never thought to use before. I angled it during meetings to capture Dean's invasive proximity, his inappropriate touching, his pattern of talking over me and taking credit. The video quality wasn't perfect, but it was evidence. I saved every text message, every late-night communication, created a separate folder for screenshots, organizing them chronologically with notes about context, started keeping a detailed journal documenting each inappropriate comment, each instance of stolen work, each time Dean undermined me professionally. I recorded audio during one-on-ones using my phone in my pocket, captured Dean making comments about my appearance, asking personal questions about my relationship status, suggesting career advancement might be easier if I was more friendly toward management. The documentation became a kind of armor, proof that I wasn't crazy, that the harassment was real, that Dean's professional demeanor was a mask covering systematic abuse. I didn't know yet what I'd do with the evidence, but having it made me feel less powerless. HR invited me for what they called a follow-up conversation. I thought maybe they'd reconsidered, that someone with authority had reviewed the situation and recognized the problems. I arrived with my documentation ready, prepared to present irrefutable evidence. Dean was already in the conference room when I walked in, sitting calmly beside Trish, his expression concerned and professional. This wasn't a follow-up conversation, it was an ambush. Trish explained they'd asked Dean to join us so we could all address the situation together, have an open conversation about the misunderstandings that had developed, clear the air like mature professionals. Dean spoke first, expressed concern about my recent behavior and performance, said he tried to be supportive but my inappropriate attention toward him was creating an uncomfortable work environment. He was worried about me, about whether I was handling workplace stress effectively. I tried to present my documentation, to show the messages and describe the harassment, but Trish kept redirecting, framing everything as miscommunication or misinterpretation. Dean maintained perfect composure, positioning himself as the concerned manager dealing with a difficult employee. The meeting ended with Trish suggesting I apologize to Dean for any misunderstanding, for misinterpreting his professional support as something inappropriate, for creating tension that was affecting team dynamics. The apology wasn't optional, it was framed as a condition for keeping my job. I apologized, sat there swallowing every ounce of pride and self-respect, while my harasser accepted my apology with magnanimous professionalism, told me he understood stress could make people perceive things incorrectly, that he hoped we could move forward with a better working relationship. Walking back to my desk, I felt something fundamental break inside me. Not my resolve exactly, but my faith that any workplace system existed to protect employees rather than management. I'd just been forced to apologize to my abuser while HR watched approvingly. That night I cried until I couldn't breathe. Then I opened my documentation folder and added detailed notes about the forced apology meeting, including the subtle threats about my continued employment. The evidence file was growing, even if I had no idea what to do with it. My performance review arrived the following week, the first negative evaluation I'd received in 5 years with the company. Dean documented concerns about my professionalism, my communication skills, my emotional stability, claimed my work quality had declined significantly, suggested I might need additional training or possibly a different role better suited to my capabilities. Every false claim was written in careful corporate language, nothing explicitly provable as retaliation, but the timing made it obvious. I'd reported harassment, and now suddenly I was incompetent. HR signed off on the review without question. My formerly excellent record was being systematically destroyed by the man who'd been harassing me. I documented the review carefully, noting the timing relative to my HR complaints, added it to my growing file of evidence. But evidence for what? Who would I show it to? HR had already made clear they were protecting Dean, not me. The team happy hour was supposed to be casual, optional, but Dean made a point of asking if I'd be attending, his tone making it clear that not showing up would be noticed. So I went, hopping to blend into the background and leave early. Dean cornered me near the bar, too close, his hand on the wall beside my head blocking my exit. He was slightly drunk, his professional mask slipping. Made comments about my body, about what he'd like to do, about how much easier my career could be if I stopped being so uptight. I pushed him away, not hard, just creating space, and Dean's voice suddenly rose, loud enough for everyone to hear, claimed I'd just come on to him, that I'd been inappropriate, that he'd had to reject my advances again. Everyone turned to look as he played the victim role perfectly, his expression more hurt than angry. The room went silent, people stared, and I stood there unable to formulate words, knowing that every witness would believe Dean's version because he was the charming manager, and I was the supposedly obsessed employee. Nobody spoke to me the next day. The silence was total and absolute. Former friends avoided eye contact in hallways. Messages I sent went unanswered. I'd become completely invisible except for the sideways glances that confirmed people were talking about me. HR called me that afternoon, suggested I take a few days off, frame it as personal time to regroup. The implication was clear. They wanted me out of the office while they figured out how to handle the situation, which meant figuring out how to protect Dean while managing me out of the company. I went home feeling erased, not just professionally diminished but fundamentally deleted from a workplace where I'd once been valued. Dean had successfully destroyed my reputation, my relationships, my career trajectory, and the company was helping him do it because protecting a manager was easier than protecting an employee. At home, I finally allowed myself to break down completely, sat on my kitchen floor crying until I had no tears left. Then I opened my laptop and started reviewing all the documentation I'd collected. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of inappropriate text messages with timestamps, audio recordings of Dean making sexual comments during one-on-ones, video footage showing his invasive touching during meetings, documentation of HR dismissing every complaint, the forced apology captured in detailed notes, my destroyed performance review saved as a PDF. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt something besides fear and humiliation. Looking at months of carefully documented evidence, I felt power. Dean had been so confident, so certain he was untouchable, but I had proof of everything. The question was what to do with it. HR wouldn't listen. The company had chosen its side, but maybe the answer wasn't trying to find justice within a system designed to protect men like Dean. Maybe justice existed somewhere else entirely. I compiled everything into one comprehensive file, organized chronologically, each piece of evidence labeled and contextualized, the inappropriate messages, the recordings of sexual comments, the videos of unwanted touching, HR's dismissive responses, the forced apology, my tanked performance review, all of it presented as a clear timeline showing systematic harassment and institutional complicity. I wrote a formal report detailing everything, not emotional, just factual, dates, times, specific incidents, exact quotes where I had them, made it as professional and irrefutable as possible. Then I sent it to HR again, requesting a formal investigation with external oversight. The response came within 2 hours, a brief email from Trish stating they reviewed my claims and found no evidence of misconduct, advised me to refrain from spreading false allegations that could be considered defamatory. The dismissal was so casual it barely qualified as a response. That evening I was leaving the office late when I heard laughter from the HR area, recognized Trish's voice and another HR rep I didn't know well. They were talking about my complaint, joking about how desperate it was. One of them said something about bunny boiler employees who couldn't take rejection. They laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. I stood in the hallway listening to HR mock the harassment I'd documented for months, and something cold and final settled in my chest. Dean's promotion was announced the following Monday, Director of Operations, effective immediately. The company-wide email praised his leadership, his professionalism, his contributions to team development. HR sent a separate message encouraging everyone to congratulate him on this well-deserved advancement. I sat at my desk reading the announcement while my hands clenched into fists. The man who'd spent months systematically harassing me was being rewarded with a promotion while I was being pushed toward termination. HR was applauding his success while dismissing my documented evidence of his misconduct. The message was clear: Dean was untouchable, the system would protect him no matter what he did, and employees like me who spoke up would be destroyed as warnings to others who might consider reporting abuse. That night I updated my evidence file one final time, added the announcement of Dean's promotion, noting the timing relative to my latest HR complaint, saved everything in multiple secure locations, and accepted that justice would never come from within the company. If the institution wouldn't hold Dean accountable, I'd have to find someone who would. I stopped trying to convince HR, stopped hoping someone in authority would suddenly develop a conscience. The system had shown me exactly what it was, a protection mechanism for powerful men, not a support structure for vulnerable employees. Instead, I created a new folder on my encrypted drive, labeled it simply Truth, compiled every piece of evidence into a clean, organized package: the messages, the recordings, the videos, the documentation of HR's dismissiveness, everything presented as an irrefutable timeline of harassment and institutional failure. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it, but having everything compiled gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. Dean thought he'd won, HR thought the problem was handled. They had no idea I'd been building a case that could destroy both of them. My research into Dean started casually, just curiosity about the man who'd made my professional life a nightmare, but what I discovered was fascinating and useful. Dean's wife, Camille, was a lifestyle influencer with a substantial online following. Her YouTube channel focused on relationships and marriage, with regular posts about maintaining healthy partnerships and mutual respect. She presented herself and Dean as the perfect couple, supportive, communicative, deeply in love. Her content was popular, her comments full of people admiring their relationship. She'd recently hit 500,000 subscribers with a video titled, "How My Husband and I Keep Romance Alive After 10 Years." The video featured Dean looking attentive and devoted, talking about respecting your partner and maintaining trust. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Dean's public image was the devoted husband, while he spent work hours sexually harassing employees. Camille built her brand on their perfect marriage, while her husband destroyed women's careers for rejecting his advances. I started following Camille's accounts, watching her videos, reading her posts, understanding her audience, and slowly a plan began forming. I learned everything I could about Camille without making contact: her posting schedule, her content themes, her audience demographics. She was particularly popular among women in their 30s discussing career-family balance and maintaining identity within marriage. Her email was publicly listed for business inquiries. Her Instagram had verification, suggesting she managed it professionally. She seemed intelligent, articulate, genuinely invested in the content she created about relationships and respect. I wondered what she'd do if she knew the truth about her husband. Would she defend him? Would she dismiss it like HR had? Or would she recognize that the man she'd built her brand around was systematically abusing his professional power? The question consumed me. Camille represented something Dean valued: his public image, his reputation beyond work. HR might not care about employee abuse, but his wife learning the truth could matter in ways institutional complaints never would. I spent 2 weeks perfecting the evidence package, not just collecting it, but organizing it for maximum clarity and impact. Created a timeline showing Dean's escalating harassment, compiled text messages with timestamps, edited audio recordings to remove dead space while keeping full context, included video clips showing his invasive behavior during meetings. Then I added the second layer: HR's complicity, screenshots of my dismissed complaints, documentation of the forced apology, recordings where I could hear them laughing about my allegations, proof that this wasn't just one bad manager but an institutional failure to protect employees. I created a simple document explaining everything, not emotional or vindictive, just factual: dates, incidents, evidence. Let the documentation speak for itself. Added a note explaining that I'd reported everything through proper channels repeatedly and been dismissed, retaliated against, and mocked. The package was devastating. Anyone reviewing it would understand immediately that Dean was a serial harasser protected by complicit HR. No ambiguity, no he said, she said, just evidence so comprehensive it couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Dean's company-wide presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning, a big event where he'd formally step into his director role and outline his vision for the department. Leadership would attend, along with most of the company. Dean had been preparing for weeks, treating it like his coronation. Wednesday night I sent the email, anonymous account, untraceable, addressed to Camille's public business email with a subject line that would make her open it: "The truth about your husband's behavior at work." The message was brief, explained that I was a colleague of Dean's who'd experienced and documented serious harassment, that HR had dismissed everything, that I was sending her evidence because the institutional systems had failed completely. Attached the comprehensive file with all my documentation. I included a note that she could verify everything. The messages came from Dean's work number, the recordings were time-stamped and authentic, the company would have records of my complaints if she wanted confirmation. I wasn't asking her to do anything specific, just providing truth she had a right to know. I sent the email at 11:47 p.m., then I went to bed and actually slept for the first time in weeks. Dean's presentation started at 10 o'clock. The auditorium was full, executives in the front rows, department staff filling the middle section, various employees watching from the back. Dean took the stage looking confident and polished, launching into his prepared remarks about leadership and vision. I sat in the back corner, my stomach tight with anticipation and something that might have been fear. I'd sent the evidence 12 hours ago. Camille had opened the email at 6:23 a.m. according to my read receipt, but I had no idea what she'd done with the information. Dean was 20 minutes into his presentation when his phone started vibrating. He ignored it initially, but the buzzing continued. Insistent, multiple calls back to back. His confidence wavered slightly as he checked the screen during a transition slide. Then the auditorium doors opened. Camille walked in. Her expression was completely controlled, but I recognized fury underneath the calm. She walked down the center aisle while everyone turned to watch, confused about why someone was interrupting the presentation. She reached the front, grabbed the presentation remote from Dean's hand, and connected her phone to the projection system. Dean's inappropriate messages filled the massive screen. His sexual comments to me displayed for everyone to see. Audio played of him making explicit remarks during what was supposed to be a professional one-on-one. Video clips showed him touching me inappropriately during meetings. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting. HR representatives were rushing toward the front trying to shut down the presentation. But Camille had control of the projection system and she wasn't stopping. More evidence played, my documented complaints to HR, recordings of them dismissing me, proof of the forced apology. Dean tried to grab the remote back, but Camille held it away. Her voice carried through the chaos, calm and devastating, asked him to explain the messages, the recordings, the pattern of harassment that his company had dismissed and covered up. Executives were on their phones. Some people were filming on their devices. The evidence played on a loop: Dean's harassment, HR's complicity, the systematic failure of every protection that should have existed. Within an hour, screenshots were spreading on social media. Someone had live-streamed the confrontation. By early afternoon, Camille had posted a video to her YouTube channel titled, "The Man My Husband Really Is." She didn't rant or cry, just calmly presented the evidence, explained that she'd built her brand on a lie, and apologized to her followers for promoting a man who abused women. The video went viral immediately. News outlets picked up the story. The company's stock started dropping, and I sat at my desk watching my harasser's entire world collapse in real time. Dean was terminated within 48 hours. The company issued a statement about taking harassment seriously and conducting a full investigation. Too late. But the public pressure made action unavoidable. HR leadership was replaced. Trish and 2 other representatives were fired. The company hired external consultants to review harassment policies and complaint procedures. They announced a complete overhaul of how allegations would be handled going forward. A law firm specializing in workplace harassment contacted me about joining a potential lawsuit against the company for negligence and retaliation. Other women started coming forward with their own stories about Dean's behavior over the years. Apparently, I wasn't the first, just the first who documented everything comprehensively enough to make denial impossible. My name started trending online, not as a victim, but as the woman who'd exposed corporate complicity in harassment. People shared my story as an example of what happened when institutional systems failed and employees had to find their own justice. The company offered me a settlement, significant money, a glowing reference, an apology from the CEO. I took the money and the apology, but I didn't go back. That workplace was poisoned for me in ways no settlement could fix. I didn't do interviews, didn't appear on news programs or write think pieces about my experience, just quietly accepted that the truth had finally come out in the most devastating way possible for everyone who'd enabled Dean's behavior. 3 months later, I was walking by the lake near my apartment when my phone buzzed with another message of support from a stranger who'd read about my story. I'd received hundreds of them, women sharing their own harassment experiences, thanking me for fighting back, asking how I'd found the courage to expose everything. I hadn't felt particularly courageous, just desperate, angry, and finally tired enough of being powerless to take a risk that could have destroyed me as easily as it destroyed Dean. But sitting by the water watching the sunset, I realized something had shifted. The fear that had consumed me for months was gone. The shame about being harassed, about being dismissed, about being gaslit by people who should have protected me, all of it had dissolved. I'd told the truth, documented it meticulously, preserved it carefully, and delivered it to someone who actually cared. The institutional systems had failed completely, but justice had found its own path anyway. My phone buzzed again. Another message, another story, another woman finding strength in what I'd done. I read it, responded with encouragement, then put the phone away and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. I'd survived, More than that, I'd fought back in the only way that mattered, not by playing by rules designed to protect abusers, but by going around the system entirely and speaking truth directly to someone who could make Dean face real consequences. The company had laughed when I reported harassment, so I'd sent the evidence to his wife, and in doing so, I'd discovered that sometimes the most powerful accountability comes not from institutions, but from the people whose opinions abusers actually care about. I whispered it to myself, testing how the words felt. I told the truth. They felt like victory, quiet, permanent, and completely mine.